Hi, I'm Shark Whitebeard here at Shark's Tavern, making another video. This video is kind of, I always like to rotate talking about the Ren fairs and then come back to some kind of historical stuff about pirate ships and ships of that era back in the golden age of pirates. So this one is like, if you signed on a ship back then, what did you expect to see? What were you going to encounter, what were you going to find out, and some of the things that you may not think about. So one of the things that always kind of fascinated me was that back in the day, a child, a young boy at 11 years old he could sign into the British Navy and become a sailor at 11, okay? And one of the jobs, they had these little 11-year-old kids run around the ship, and one of the jobs they had was called the powder monkey, okay? So what it was is that when a ship of war, a battleship, got in an engagement with another ship and they're shooting out with the cannons and they're in the lower decks, opening the hatches so they could shoot the cannons through the hatches, you didn't want to have a bunch of powder, kegs of powder laying around to load up the cannons, because if the enemy shoots something through your ship, and then also with the guys usually you had to have lit torches to fire the cannons, you didn't want a bunch of powder laying around or sitting around the kegs because you'd blow up the whole ship up. It'd be a chain reaction and blow the thing up. So what they did was they kept the powder in kegs and barrels below on the lowest deck they could get, which was the lowest deck was below the water line of the ship, figuring that it was safe, it wasn't going to blow up, couldn't accidentally blow up or the enemy shoot a cannonball or something through there and ignite it. So what they had was, it was so cramped in there and the ceiling was so low because they had the powder crammed in there, is that a grown man would probably have to get on his knees or crawl through there to grab the powder. So they had the kids, the little 11-year-old kids, and they were powder monkeys. Their job was to run down, grab a keg of powder, and run back up and give it to the guys loading the cannon, just enough to load the cannon for one shot, because they didn't want excess barrels sitting around that could ignite. So they give them that, they load up the cannon, get ready to shoot, and the kid had to run back down and grab another barrel and bring it back and keep it to everyone so they fired as soon as they got the powder. And that job is called the powder monkey. It was very dangerous. It was very hard work. The kid had to be running back and forth through the battle, up and down, and keeping the men supplied with powder. So that's one of the jobs, probably not one of the best jobs, but that's what they used the kids for, was being a powder monkey. Another slogan saying, which I kind of thought it was very interesting, was there's a slogan or saying called "a son of a gun." People used to say, "You son of a gun," what does that mean? Well, what it meant was, back in the day, the conditions on the pirate ships were so bad, or any ship, the Navy ships, any kind of ships, were so bad that when they got into port, they would not let the crew go ashore and have fun, whatever, get drunk, because the crew would probably take off and run away and never come back, because they didn't want to come back to this ship that was really, the conditions were so bad. So the men were confined to the ship. They couldn't leave the ship. So what they would do is they give the men what they called a grog ration. Grog was basically a mixture of water and rum. Depending on how much water you mixed with the rum was how strong the drink was. They said the rum back then was pretty strong. You're looking between 90 and 100 proof rum. So they let them get drunk on the ship because they were in port, and then they would bring professional harlots, ladies of the night. They bring them onto the ship. For the men to, and the women to practice their profession with the men. And they bring them into the lower decks, and on the lower decks they didn't have any, furniture, nothing. They just had the guns and the cannons. So they would, bend the women over the cannons and stuff and practice their profession right there and practice what they were doing. And then after they were done, the women, they take them off the ship, and the men were satisfied, drunk, and had the company of young women, or women, period. So when someone called you a son of a gun, what they were insinuating, or what they weren't really insinuating, they were just flat out saying it, that your mother was a professional lady, a harlot, your father was probably some sailor, and you were conceived over a cannon and that's how you came about. So it's basically a very derogatory, I would think, insulting thing to say to someone, to call them a son of a gun. But that's where that slogan came from. Another thing, the bad things on the ship was the food rations. The food, they had no refrigeration, they couldn't keep the food fresh or anything like that, so they packed the ship full of food, non-perishable stuff that they could give to the crew. One of the things was they had hardtack biscuits, and needless to say, they'd be in barrels and stuff, and they weren't all that packed that safely or whatever. So they'd get a bunch of weevils. They'd get the weevils and the biscuits. You had cheese that they would give to the men, ration them out cheese when they had their meals, and the cheese usually got worms in them and got mold on them and everything else. Another thing was salt pork, and the salt pork, they'd salt the pork with salt, of course, to keep it preserved so the men could eat it. It wouldn't go bad, but of course, needless to say, the salt pork would get full of maggots. So you're given, biscuits with weevils, cheese with worms, and salt pork with maggots in it. So what they used to do also is they would have live animals on the ships. So they could butcher them whenever they were ready to eat them so that they didn't have to preserve them. And one of the things they had is keep chickens on the ship sometimes. And there was a book I read where the admiral, he brought a bunch of captains out of his squadron. They're out at sea, and he had the captains come over for the admiral's, like a banquet to give to the captains. And they sat down, and he was serving he set several chickens to all the captains, and the chickens were very well fed, and they looked really good. And one of the captains asked the admiral, said, wow, these chickens look very fat and very plump, and are really good eating. And he said, what's your secret? Usually when you get chickens on board a ship, or animals, they don't eat very well because they're on a ship and stuff, they're not treated very well. How do you keep them so well fed? And the admiral said, well, that's the trick right there. Because what I do is I take the weevils from the biscuits, the worms from the cheese, and the maggots from the pork, and I feed it to the chickens. And that keeps them pretty well fed. So that was the secret to keeping the chickens well fed before you're able to serve them up. So that's some of the conditions you would think on if you got onto a ship. So please subscribe, share, like, give me a thumbs up, post a comment if you like and want more videos like this. Thank you very much.